Hello everyone and welcome back to Microtech Knives. Guys, what we're going to do in today's video, it's going to be a long form video. We're going to cover how to maintenance your knife, and this is going to be on the Ultratech Zero Blade Play, as well as full disassembly and reassembly of the knife should you have an issue with it. So before we get started, let's talk about what you're going to need to be able to service your knife if it doesn't work properly. You might want a can of brake parts cleaner. We also recommend the Remington rim oil. Whether it is aerosol or it is the dropper, you can get most of this stuff at your local hardware store or any big value store. You should be able to get this pretty easily. You'll also want a pair of safety glasses as well as some gloves. So if your knife is working properly, of course, no issue. But if you start to have issues, let's say you get some debris or sediment in here, and I'm going to actually do that here in just a moment. We're going to show you how to be able to get your knife up and running without having to send it back to Microtech. If you want to send it back to us, of course, you can always do that. Just go online to our website. You're going to fill out an RA ticket, and you'll get a return authorization number, and then they'll be able to service it for you. That would be for things like sharpening or having broken parts or springs replaced that you might have lost. So on this knife, this is an Ultratech Zero Blade Play. It works perfectly. There's nothing wrong with this knife. But what we're going to do is we're going to simulate something getting into the knife. So what I've got is some cut sheetrock here. Let's say you were using it for cutting sheetrock and you were to get some of this debris into the knife. It happens. This could be sand, this could be anything. But let's say you get something in the knife and then you try to fire it and it doesn't fire. This is probably the most common problem you're going to run into. We're going to reset it, and on the Zero Blade Play you want to always reset downwards, not outwards. And it's still not working, guys. So you can see it's failing to fire. Guys, one of the things you can do first off is use compressed air and see if that works for you. You can apply it on the back side where the holes are and just spray it in here. If you've got compressed air having not enough power to it, you could use a nozzle like this and basically just try to blow that residual out. I can tell you I put a lot in here, so I don't know if that's going to do it. Probably not, because I'm feeling that resistance in there. But you see, just some compressed air solved the problem. Now, let's say you had more in there. Let's say you got really, really dirty with your knife. We're going to put a lot of this in here. We're going to fill it up. Let's say you dropped it in the sand. And let's say air is not doing the trick. I mean, we're locked up pretty hard. I almost can't even pull this out of here. You can also run it under tap water, flush it out after you've already blown it out with the air. And then after you do that, you're going to want to re-oil it. You can literally use the rim oil, flood the mechanism on the back side, and it should get it up and running. Either way, we're going to try to do that for you here, one cut. So first thing I'm going to do is use air, blow it out, and then gently try to work your blade. And you can see I'm still getting stuck here, so I have a lot of material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the sink. We're going to just wash it out. I'm going to straight over here to the sink. We'll just put some water in it, see if it'll flush some of that out. So coming over here to the sink, we're just going to flood it. Now this is water, so I don't really need protective equipment on. And I can feel it freeing up with that debris, it being gone. But remember, we've removed all the lubricant from this knife. There is no oil in here at this moment, other than what was left over. And guys, before you use any type of brake parts cleaner or oil, we always recommend that you do use eye and hand protection. Just go ahead and glove up. And of course, it's going to stick to my hands. That's okay, because my hands are wet. And using a liberal amount of oil is not going to hurt anything. Just go ahead and flood the back side. You can go ahead and flood the button area. It's not going to hurt it. And we're just going to work the knife a few times like this. Shake out any residual. Blow it out with compressed air, because more is not always better when it comes to these knives, okay? So let's go ahead and see if we can reset this. And we're back up to running. So it still feels a little sluggish. I might have to repeat that process a couple of times, but something that simple can get your Ultratech running again, or any of the other knives for that matter. But if it doesn't work and you need to go into the actual system itself, what we're going to do is we're going to do a very, very comprehensive video on how to disassemble the knife and reassemble it, and also the proper lubrication areas. Guys, if you are not mechanically inclined, do not do this step by step by watching the video. Watch the video all the way through. Make sure you have all the proper tools. Make sure you have everything that you need to be able to put this thing back together, and that you have the aptitude to do this. Because if we receive a knife back that is just parts in a box because you can't figure it out, there might be a cost involved with that. We do this every day. We do make it look simple, but if you don't have the proper tools or the know-how, then we don't recommend you disassemble your knife. Just send it back to us and we'll get it fixed for you. So let's say you've tried everything, you've flushed it out, you've used water, you've used brake parts cleaner, you used the rim oil, and you just didn't get success. Sometimes what happens is when you use your Microtech out the front and you cut boxes or cut other material, you will bring that material, like pieces of tape, into the actual action. We see it all the time. Well, if you introduce a foreign object into the action and you can't get it out, it might need to be disassembled, or it's going to have to be sent back into Microtech. Guys, if you don't understand what's going on with the internals, then feel free to contact us. We can service it, we can sharpen the knife and get it back to you just like it was when you purchased it. However, if you feel like you have the ability to disassemble your knife or to also tune that zero blade play system, then this video is for you. I urge you to watch the video first to make sure that you have everything you need to be able to do this, not only the tools, but also the aptitude to do it, because while we are professionals, we do it every day. It's not rocket science, it's actually pretty easy, but you're not going to have access to any spare parts. So if you lose any springs or anything like that, you will have to send the knife back into Microtech to be serviced and have those parts replaced. So if you understand all that, let's talk about some of the tools you're going to need for the disassembly as well as tuning of the zero blade play system. All right, so some things you're going to need. One would be a roll of paper towels. You want something to be able to deploy the knife into, but we also recommend laying the paper towels down. Go ahead and secure them with some tape or something like that, because if you try to disassemble your knife on a hard surface like this table, springs and parts will bounce, and so that will help reduce that bounce process. As far as safety glasses, we also recommend the safety glasses because you're going to be dealing with springs, as well as a set of gloves when you get back into lubricating the knife itself. Now, as far as tools, you're going to need a set of Torx, T-O-R-X drivers. You're going to need a T30, as well as a T20, as well as a T8. You're probably not going to be able to purchase this. What you need is a small flat blade jeweler's screwdriver. It's going to be a very narrow width as well as a narrow blade. These have been turned down. We make these in the shop. They aren't for sale, but you can use eyeglass type screwdrivers or jeweler screwdrivers to be able to adjust that set screw that holds the blade stop pin in. You're also going to need white lithium grease, as well as rim oil. Now, I will tell you the applicator bottle here puts too much oil out. So we actually put them in a precision oiler, and this will help quite a bit so that you can control that oil. The zero blade play system does not like to be over oiled. It's almost run dry, but there are some critical lubrication points that we'll show you in the video that you will need to lubricate upon assembling the knife. Another thing that's extremely helpful are a set of precision tweezers. You're going to be dealing with some small springs going into the front and rear lock, and these can be a big benefit on holding onto those springs and not losing them. So if you guys are ready, let's get started. All right, so if you're ready to disassemble your Ultratech, the first thing that we recommend that you do is, if it is able to fire, you want to fire it into something soft. Okay, do not do this up against any body parts or anything like that. We're just going to go ahead and fire it, and that will put this blade in a neutral type position. Now remember, you do have a sharp surface here. One of the things you can do is just press that back like that so that that point is pretty much out of the way, or that edge anyway, but you're still going to have a small exposed point sticking outside. The next thing we want to do is, it doesn't matter the order, you can go ahead and remove the 4 chassis screws, or you can remove the pocket clip. It doesn't matter. We're actually going to start with the chassis screws. Now for the chassis screws, you're going to need a T8 for this, okay? Make sure that you're using a Torx 8, and what we're going to do is start removing the chassis screws here. So make sure that you're deep into the pocket of the actual screw so that you're not going to mar that screw. And you want to have a place to put all of these screws because they are going to move and fall, and you don't want to lose any of the items. We will not send you replacement parts. Any replacement parts that might be lost during disassembly or assembly are going to have to be, the entire knife will have to be sent back into Microtech. So we're going to remove these 4 screws. And once we do this, the knife will not fall apart because it is still being retained by the actual pocket clip. Now, in order to remove this, you're going to need your T30. It doesn't matter which side. We'll just go ahead and start on the pocket clip side. But these 2 T30 screws are a different length. This is very important. I'll explain that here in just a minute. But we're going to take our T30. We'll start on the pocket clip side, and we will remove this. We do use Loctite on all of these screws, so you will have to use a decent amount of force to break that Loctite. Once we do that, you're going to remove the pocket clip, and you'll also see that this is a long screw. You guys see that? We're going to compare it to the one on the other side. Just remember, long screw always goes in the pocket clip. Now I'm going to stop there for just a moment to give you guys a pointer or a tip. Let's say the only reason you needed to remove your pocket clip was because your pocket clip was sprung and it didn't have enough tension on your pocket. What you can do is take one of your tools, put it in here, and you can either gently tighten it by pulling down this way, or you could loosen it by pushing up this way. So that's how you can set your tension, whether your pocket clip is too light or too tight for your liking, and depending on what thickness of the pants you wear. All right, so once we do this, now we're going to remove this last T30. When you remove this last T30, you want to make sure that you're keeping downward pressure on the top of the chassis as well as the bottom, because it will come apart and you will have parts flying everywhere. So what we're going to do is take this T30 and we're going to remove it. This is the short one. This is the non-pocket clip side. And so you guys, I'm going to hold it side by side here. You'll see that this screw is shorter than this one, okay? Now at this point, the glass brake will actually fall or pull out just like that. Okay, so make sure that you don't drop it. Always try to do this over a table or a workspace that you'll be able to find any parts if you do lose them. The next step we want to do before we pull the top cover off is put downward pressure on the button itself. There is a spring underneath here, and if you don't have the finger here, that spring is going to fall off and you will lose it. So if you've got downward pressure on the button, you're just going to gently lift the top cover off. Once you do that, we're going to just place this to the side. And then now we're going to gently release pressure off that button, and you will see the button with the spring underneath. Also notice that you have a gap right here. This is always going to be on the part that goes here at the top. So it always goes in this way. You cannot reinstall this button upside down. Now taking this screw out, or this spring out, you're going to see it's a tiny, tiny spring. I'm going to put it on the table so you can see it, but you can see how easy these bounce around. We're just going to lay those to the side. The next thing is going to be the slider mechanism. Now, if you're disassembling a Hera 2 or a Luminary or a Cypher that doesn't have chassis screws, there are going to be 4 studs here. Never remove those studs. We're not going to design a knife where we have to take studs out to reinstall or install a slider. So in this case, you're just going to lift it straight out. On the Luminary and the other ones, you're going to lift it, rotate it slightly, and you should be able to pull it out that way, but never ever touch those screws if you have a Luminary or any of those other models. Now, while I have this on the table, I want to point out what we're going to call these, or the nomenclature. You have your front leg mount, rear leg mount, and you have dual springs. Now, depending on the year of the knife that you are working on, if it's an older Microtech out the front and rear leg mount are different. In this case, on the Ultratech, these are identical. They can be used interchangeably, and they are hooked underneath this slider mechanism. So what we're going to do is hold the slider, and we're going to pull gently and remove this from the slider mechanism. If you've gotten this far and you see a broken spring, guys, you're done. At that point, you're going to need to send it in for repair. Just go ahead and try to put it back together and then send us the complete knife and say that you do have a broken internal spring. It does happen. Now, let me go ahead and unhook these so you can see each individual part. There's a rear leg mount. Here are your two springs. And here is the front leg mount. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a moment to just kind of clean up the area. You're going to see your top cover. You've got your pocket clip. You have your 4 chassis screws. You have your T30 pocket clip side long, non-pocket clip side short. You have your glass brake. You have your button. You have your button spring that always gets lost. And then we have the 2 springs, slider, front leg mount, rear leg mount. So those are your components thus far. Now looking at the actual chassis, you're going to see that you have a blade, the bottom half of the chassis, you have a blade stop pin, you have a front lock and a rear lock. All right, so one of the things that we've seen from customers is they're trying to remove this screw or loosen your blade stop pin before loosening the set screw that is underneath here. I'm going to show you a close-up of that, and I'm going to try to get the light right, but there's actually a set screw that is in the bottom of this blade that you can access through this hole at the bottom. So don't try to do this with this blade all the way out at an angle with your screwdriver, because what's going to happen is you're going to strip the head of that screw out. So what you can do is just move this all the way to the rear, and then that way you can access it from the back. First thing we have to do is loosen that set screw first. I'm trying to show you with the light here, but we're going to insert our flat blade jeweler screwdriver, make sure it's got a good engagement, and we're going to loosen this set screw. Now, loosening it is fine. I'm going to remove this for purposes of the demonstration so you guys can see how small this set screw is. You do not need to take it all the way out, but that is what we're talking about when we talk about the set screw. At this point, you're not going to be able to loosen your blade stop pin unless it is in a clear position all the way to the rear. Otherwise, it will not clear the sides, meaning this screw is wider than the 2 sides. So you're going to take a T20. A T20 is going to go in here, and you're going to loosen your blade stop pin. Once you loosen this, this is going to fall out. I'll show you a close-up of this, but this will allow the blade to come out of the actual bottom half of the chassis. But, guys, what I need you to see is that when this rear lock engages, you're not going to be able to slide the blade forward. You're going to have to manually pull down on this rear lock. I'm going to show you this with a tool. As this goes down, the blade can go forwards. Once we do that, now we can pull this blade all the way out. Remember, it is a sharp blade. This is where things get a little bit dicey, okay? You do not want to lose, there's 2 conical springs. One is going to be located under the front lock, one is under the rear lock. I don't know if you guys can see that in the light, but they are tiny, tiny conical springs. What I do is I hold one, doesn't matter which one you do first, and then I cup my hand and I do that. Now usually that will get it started on coming out. You guys can see that in the angle there, how it's starting to come out. But doing that a couple times, we usually get this to come out a little bit further and further. But be careful, because once this thing comes out, that spring is going to go flying. So if you see, we're slowly starting to work this out. Now guys, this is probably going to be the hardest thing to do on the entire assembly. I don't recommend ever taking the front and rear lock out of the knife unless it's absolutely necessary because there's debris or something caught up into this. I am going to remove it for purposes of this demo, but remember, you have a spring on top of this that's under a lot of pressure. So if you have a set of tweezers, you can see how I can pull this out. And remember, this actually has a split in it. So if it gets hung up in the chassis, you don't want to force it. So right now, we actually have a split in that lock that's caught in between this track and the back of it. So what we have to do is get something without damaging the actual knife itself and work this out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the front lock out, but there is a little conical spring that's balanced on top of this. If you guys can see that. I'm actually going to let it fall on the white here so you guys can see it. It is a tiny, tiny conical spring. You can see it's tapered. This is always going to be the part that goes on top of the chassis, and then the bottom portion is what rests on that leg mount itself, on that front lock. You'll see it also has a split in it. This is always the one that goes up towards the front. On the rear, same thing. You can see how that fell out just like that. You can see the conical spring on top. That's the way they normally come out. But don't lose these two springs. Just a little bit of pressure and these go all over the place. At this point, you can take a toothbrush. You can scrub gently inside of the blade track. But what you're looking for is making sure that your blade basically goes in here smoothly. It will fall out smoothly. It will go back in smoothly because it has no resistance from anything. Once everything's cleaned and dried, then we're going to reinstall it to show you how you're going to time everything. Okay, so before you drop the blade or anything into the chassis, once everything is clean and wiped off, make sure it doesn't have any oil on it or anything like that. Now what we want to do is get these locks back into the chassis. So it doesn't matter which one you start with. We're just going to go ahead and start with the rear lock. And we're going to take a conical spring and put it on top of the circle here. Now, if you have gloves on or if you have really big fingers, it might be better to use a set of precision tweezers like this. And you want to place it in this lock pocket. Okay, I'm trying to do this where you guys can see the light, but basically we're just going to drop it into this hole. Now at this point, if you release the spring too quickly, it's going to bounce out of there. Now you always have to check to make sure that this lock is moving freely. You'll feel the tension, you'll see the tension on it like that. That is working properly. Now we're just going to do the exact same thing with the front lock. So on the front lock, you want to make sure that the split is facing the opening of the knife. We're going to place the conical spring on here. We're going to pinch it with a set of precision tweezers. And we're going to insert it into the lock pocket here. Now if you drop this at this point, you will lose that spring. It will go flying like it's about to do right now. You see that? And then you're going to bend it and it won't work properly. So now that we have the front lock in, you need to visually look and make sure, and then also test it, that you're not getting any binding. You should have resistance here and good spring pressure. So front and rear lock are now installed. Next thing we want to do is drop the blade into the track. Now do not just force this in here because it's only going to go so far, because what's going to happen is this front lock is going to hit here on the blade and it will stop it. It won't allow it to go back any further. So what you want to do is take your finger and move down on that front lock, and that will allow the blade to pass by it. You want to check and make sure. You will have some slight resistance, but you want to make sure that this will slide over the rear lock as well. You'll have a little bit of resistance if you don't have any oil on it. That's fine. We're just showing you how to install it. Once you get to this spot, what you're going to need to do is slide the blade all the way to the rear. So now you can reinstall the stop pin. On the stop pin, you want to use blue Loctite on the threads right here, very lightly, okay? We do not apply this liberally. We just want a little bit of blue Loctite here on the stop pin. For purposes of this demo, we're not going to apply that because we're going to show you a couple other things that you need to do. You're going to take your T20, and what you're going to do is screw this. Do not cross thread anything. Once you take your T20 and you start screwing the blade stop pin in, if you go all the way to the bottom, that's the most travel, and it's going to lock out very, very quickly. If you feel drag on this, we're going to use the rear lock. We're going to try to slide the blade forwards. It doesn't move because what we've done is we've bottomed out that stop pin into the bottom channel of the chassis. So that's going to be too tight. So what we're going to need to do is back this off a little bit. Make sure that we have free travel here. Next thing we want to do is we want to install that small set screw. So on this set screw, that's going to go into that little small hole on the back of the blade that you guys can see there. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. Here is one way that I prefer, is we get it started into the hole. Make sure nothing cross threads on this. And what we're going to do is get that set screw just to screw into the back of the blade and get it started. That's all. We don't want to screw that in all the way because then we're going to lock the stop pin down. So you can see that it is protruding right here off the back side. Now comes the timing portion. If we pull this out gently on the blade, where I want your attention to focus is on this front lock. If we pull this out gently and it doesn't go, meaning this lock cannot fall in behind the blade, then what we're going to need to do is loosen the blade stop pin slightly. Okay, just a little bit goes a long ways. So because we're not trying to remove it from the chassis completely, what we can do is just loosen it slightly. A little bit goes a long ways, so I'm just going to do just a little bit of a turn, and let's see if we get it. Nope, not yet. So we're going to go a little bit more. There are usually marks here, but if you don't have a mark, you can use a black marker or a black Sharpie and just put a mark on both points so you can tell how much you're actually turning it. And you see there, we got full lockout with barely any pressure pulling it out. So it's going to be somewhere between here and then tightening it back up again. What we're looking for, we're going to do 1/8 of a turn, maybe here. We're going to pull that out. Now you see that even with a little bit of pressure, we don't get full lockout. But this isn't how the blade deploys. When you actually deploy the blade, it actually uses a little bit of force. And so if I use that force, you guys can see now there's no blade play. That would actually be a pretty good setting for where I needed to be. So just think about it. If you screw this in clockwise, it is going to keep this from engaging. We do want a full engagement, unlike the luminary, where we were looking for this to be about a 75 to 80% engagement. On the Ultratech zero blade play with slight pressure, we want full engagement of that lock. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull the blade back. We also have a little bit of blue Loctite on this set screw. And we want to make sure we hit an index point. Now, what I mean by that is that set screw locates on little small pockets within the screw itself. We want to make sure that we are hitting one of those. So you're going to take your T20, you're going to wiggle it slightly to make sure that we're in one of those pockets. Remember, this is still kind of loose. I'm in a pocket, I can feel it, and then I'm just going to tighten it. Just snug is good. We're going to check it once again. Slight pull, doesn't lock. A little bit of force. We've got about 75% engagement. And then if we simulate how the knife actually fires, we get almost a full engagement on that lock. So that would be timed perfectly. Now, before we start oiling, I need to go over these oil points with you on what you need to oil. You need to take a little small precision oiler. If you use too much, this knife will not work. You want to put a drop just forwards of the blade on that transition. It is going to be located right here in this area of the knife, okay, on that little chamfer. You want to take a slight drop of oil and put it on the front lock and on the rear lock. That is all the oil that this needs, with the exception of maybe a drop in the opening on each side. That's all it needs, guys, nothing else. Now what we want to do is assemble the slider. Now with regards to cleaning all these parts, just make sure that you're using some type of cleaner, that you're not leaving any type of residue or oil on this. It doesn't matter what you're using with regards to, I mean, you could do, gun solvent, anything like that, but you want these nice and free of any lint or debris, okay? So on that slider, you want this post up towards the top, away from you. And then you're going to take your front leg mount and a spring, and these springs have hooks, open-ended hooks. You guys can see that in the video. You want to hook upwards. So we want this opening up. And on the other spring, same thing, opening up. Always hook from underneath. We're going to take that rear leg mount and we're going to hook it on these as well. Same thing, from underneath. So when you have everything hooked, you have your front and rear leg mount. You can simply drape it, take your slider, and this will actually hook onto the back of the slider. But this is what typically happens. One of your springs will come off. So it is a little bit of a timing thing on getting these on there properly. You might have to do this a time or two. Once you have the rear hooked, place a thumb on top of it and then hook the front. And now everything is locked. On the back side, it will look like this. Now what we're going to do is put a drop of oil there, here, no more than this, guys, here, here. And you're going to also do one on the top where the button goes, right here, just one little drop there. That is all this knife will need. As far as the slider, you want to make sure that you put a drop underneath the slider here and here. Basically underneath the leg mount, but on top of the slider. You're going to place this on top of the chassis, and you should have free movement. Now, right now, we're not going to have that because of the way the blade position's in here, but it needs to move like this. Now is when the white lithium grease comes into play. If you don't want any spring sing, we recommend a very small amount of white lithium grease in the center of each spring. Very little bit goes a long ways. Guys, if you overdo this, you can actually retard the timing of the actual knife. So just a little bit on there. You don't need to smear it because your top cover is going to do that. Once you get to this point, what you're going to do is you're going to take the button, have it in a position to be ready to go into this chassis. And then on the top cover, the oil points are going to be in that button track, dot, 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 forwards, rearwards. So that's all you have to do, nothing else. While it's laying on the table, we're going to take the button with the spring in it and we can rotate it into the track. This keeps everything on your workspace. And then now we're going to install the top cover. Make sure everything is lined up. Once you get that top cover, keep pressure on the top and the bottom of the chassis. Your button should move freely without much friction. At this point, before you do any more assembling, let's go ahead and test it. So what we're going to do is we are going to reset the zero blade play by hitting downwards on our hands, and then now holding pressure on it, we should be able to fire it. Check it for function. We'll always check it straight upright, upside down, and then we also need to check and see if we have blade play. There is none. That is a perfectly adjusted zero blade play knife. There is no movement whatsoever. If I had some wiggle, then what I would do is reverse the process, loosen the set screw, tighten clockwise just the slightest little bit, and then we can tune all of the play out of it. But I'm satisfied with that. So the next thing we need to do is apply a little bit of blue Loctite to each one of the chassis screws. Just a little dab will go a long ways, and you can use blue or red on the pocket clip. Doesn't matter the order. We're going to take our T8 and the screw. We're going to pretend this does have Loctite on it. And guys, we cannot give you a torque rating on this. However, we've already seen some guys that have used too much muscle on these screws that have stripped the threads out of the bottom chassis. Guys, if you do that, you have ruined the knife. That is not something that we can replace without a large cost to you, because that is an entire bottom chassis. So don't use too much. You definitely want to rely on the chemicals to keep these tight, and snug goes a long ways, guys. So do not over tighten these. Notice how I guide the screw into the hole so I'm not scratching the surface. Once you've got these down and they're tightened, check it again for function. Now we can take the rear glass break, and whichever side, if you're a lefty or a righty, you can take the pocket clip and install the pocket clip. Now typically we put a piece of plastic here to separate so we're not scratching the actual chassis itself. And remember, it is going to be the long T30 that goes into this. Remember, you use some Loctite on that. We can go ahead and tighten this down. And then we'll do the small pocket clip retainer T30. Once you've done that, go ahead and test the knife, up, down. Check for play, but don't cut yourself on the live blade. And that's how you service your Ultratech Zero Blade Play. All right, so that is what it takes to assemble and disassemble and tune your zero blade play Ultratech. Remember, once again, if you don't feel comfortable doing it, just go online to microtechknives.com. You can fill out an RA request form and we can do all of that work for you. Just remember, all of our knives come with a full lifetime warranty, but it doesn't cover lost parts. So make sure that you're comfortable doing it and follow us on our social media for more good information.